Welcome to Pretty Equity, where we dive into the real issues beauty investors and founders need to understand and bring you the answers from the experts behind the scenes. I'm Melory Johnson, 25-year beauty veteran, advisor, and strategist. Today's episode tackles something many assume is straightforward: lab testing. But in beauty, especially with SPF and clinical performance claims, a lab report can become the foundation of an entire brand. But over the past year, SPF testing in particular has been under intense scrutiny, where serious allegations have raised a much bigger question. What happens when the test results you're building your business on aren't real? Joining me today is Brian Ecclefield, former insider and whistleblower who understands firsthand how lab integrity can make or break claims, brands, and investor trust. Together, we'll explore how to spot lab risk, demand accountability, and protect your investment before the damage becomes irreversible. Brian, welcome to Pretty Equity. I'm so excited to be talking to you.
Thank you, Mel. It's a pleasure, as always, to be here talking to you as well.
Before we dive in, can you please introduce yourself and share your story for those in the audience who don't already know you?
My name is Brian Ecclefield, and for the last almost 17 years, I've been involved behind the scenes with skincare clinical research. I've worked for a number of different laboratories that do claim support, safety studies, and efficacy for things like OTC products, sunscreens, dandruffs, certain medical devices, lots of cosmetics, water resistance, and longevity studies. So generally speaking, the clinical lab is a name that consumers wouldn't necessarily recognize unless they had a reason to, and we could get into some of that later, I'm sure. But so my life has been all about behind the scenes support for clinical research for mass marketed products. And I've worked with most of the brands that people listening would have heard of or use in their daily lives, even though you probably never heard of validated claim support.
Thank you for that. Before we get into the specifics of today's conversation, I want to level set for everyone watching who's new to beauty. Product testing is often treated as a check the box item, something brands think they need just to say they've passed. But in reality, testing is one of the core systems that sits between a product, the consumer, and the assumptions a business is making about safety, performance, and risk. So let's start at the foundation. Brian, for those who may be new to beauty, can you explain what a third-party testing lab actually does and why that role matters in the real world, but beyond just producing a report to check a box?
A new product is getting ready to launch. Internally, a brand or a formulator is going to do some pilot research to make sure that it really hydrates or it really moisturizes. They're going to choose their suppliers on the ingredient side and make sure they have a good name and quality ingredients. But in reality, does that final formula actually perform when it's applied to human skin? On top of that, does it cause irritation if it's used a little bit more than what the suggested use instructions might say or state? So both of those two elements are key, and they're not really something that you can wholly ethically do internally. So as an example, if I'm a major skincare manufacturer and I ask my employees to test my new product, they could have a bias and they could want it to perform because they could risk losing their job. So generally speaking, you're meant to use a third party unbiased research institute in order to collect your data and put it into a proper presentation format for you.
Okay. So there's also a common assumption that there's a standard set of tests every cosmetic product has to pass. Can you walk us through what testing is actually required under FDA law for cosmetics and how additional testing depends on product type, intended use, or risk profile. What I mean is, for example, why an eye cream, a diaper paste, an SPF product would reasonably require very different testing than, say, I don't know, a rinse-off cleanser.
Here in the US, there is a really unique regulatory structure. So FDA will require that certain OTC or drug claims are substantiated based on a proven or regulated monograph. Take SPF as the prime example there. There's a published test method that must be followed. For just about every other product category, the FDA will tell you that you need clear and sufficient data to support whatever claims that you may have. That's not a clear statement by any means, and it's open to a lot of interpretation. I think it's safe to say that most products that are going to end up on a shelf somewhere, whether it's in somebody's bathroom or retail, should be tested for potential toxicology, container compatibility, preservative efficacy, and stability. Like those elements across the board are something that every brand or startup should consider on every single SKU. Outside of that, what you say about your product from a performance perspective is critical. So you have to dig in deeper if you're trying to make stronger statements. If you're talking about wrinkles, fine lines, or anti-aging, or hydrating, all of those types of things need to be proven. Even things like microbiome. You can't talk about those anywhere in or around your marketing materials without sufficient safety and efficacy data. So what you should do is consider your overall budget and pick your hero products out. Don't try to make every claim under the sun for every product because not all of them are as potent as other ones. Certain things like moisturizers and basic facial moisturizers don't necessarily need to go through the same rigor as your true hero retinol anti-aging product over a 12-week period.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so, for the audience, once you understand that testing isn't uniform, many of the common misconceptions just fall away. Talking of which, Brian, where do founders and investors most often misunderstand what a lab report represents and what it does not?
I think a lot of times there is a big disconnect between the fact that you've conducted some type of testing and then what you're responsible for as the lab. And in reality, you as the manufacturer, you're responsible for everything you say about your product. You're also responsible to make sure that that lab report was conducted following the standards that it claims that it was. So realistically, as much of a burden as it might sound like, you should be visiting any labs who are doing in vivo work in your supply chain. You should also be visiting your manufacturers, your packaging suppliers. So, I mean, I think it stands to reason if those are best practices, that you should also be going to the clinical site that's doing the human participant level research on your behalf. That is, by current FDA standards, part of good manufacturing processes. So it is the lab or the manufacturer's responsibility to make sure the testing is being done the right way, even if you as a founder don't understand testing.
Well, I mean, this is exactly why you and I are having this conversation. Because we're not assuming that the people who may be new to this or interested in getting involved here are going to know anything at all. And that brings me to my next question, because what I often see, investors and founders alike, they will see a report and absolutely assume it's objective and final. All right.
Mhm.
So, you and I both know that you can't assume anything in beauty, right? You can't take anything for granted. But, if we're talking about misconceptions and myths, what do you think is the one, or what are the biggest myths about lab testing that you've seen over the years that you think need to be busted immediately?
The number one thing, which I think you kind of alluded to, is that in any case, it should be wholly taken for granted. It's a really relationship driven piece of the puzzle, and you have to build trust over time. So getting out there, meeting the people who are involved with testing, seeing participants coming through the door, reviewing the times it takes to get data, interacting with the lab team, going through the lab report and asking the potential team who had worked on it or the CRO to walk you through if there's any places that they think there's callouts that are worth speaking about. These are all the types of things that, I mean, they take time to learn, just like any other sort of nuanced piece of the industry or skill set. So, number one is that lab data is foolproof. Just because there is a report, it's inherently true or it was collected in the right manner. I do think that while that's difficult to potentially come to an understanding of, might take a couple years to get familiar with lab reports, what you can do is be super transparent. So post your data, not just make your claims. Go a step above and beyond. Right now, brands are pushing this whole puffery claim of beauty backed by science. And that doesn't mean anything unless you can actually tell people what the science behind your product is and represents. So publish the data, whether it's on your own website with a link, let consumers and let the industry comment. Especially with like sunscreen and SPF work, it's a standardized test. There's nothing proprietary in those reports or methodologies that a brand should be afraid of. If you want to block out your formula name or your batch number, like go ahead and redact that, but publish the method you used to get to the results. It's only going to build consumer confidence.
No, absolutely. And look, I think you and I both agree that consumers are becoming more savvy as the years go by, and they're expecting more. And I think that this whole, standard of science, the whole backed by science, is becoming more and more important to consumers. So I think that the more you can back yourself up, the better, because I don't think people are falling for the good old tricks anymore. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Just because you claim something, you know what I mean? Everyone is going to believe it because it sounds nice. I think consumers have moved beyond that. I don't know if you want to react to that.
I think it's a good point. And during 2020, with the pandemic, a lot of the market factors and distribution channels shifted. So direct to consumer and indie brands have had more power than they ever had in the past. So with a much tighter marketing budget, you can sort of influence or get a product out there in a manner that would have required the old HSN QVC model to do over a short period of time. So distribution channels have completely changed. That puts the onus even further on the brands. So now you see brands that scale in a hurry, and it's so important to get your core safety and product testing in while you are small, because if you become the next big thing, you've got way more exposure. There's risk that more consumers could have a reaction. Certain hair types won't agree with your product, as we've seen over the last couple of years. So you really need to consider the next 2 to 3 year horizon, as difficult as that can be from a testing and scalability size. The bigger you get, the more the Unilevers or the L'Oreals of the world are going to say, you didn't prove that. I'm going to sue you and I'm going to shut you down, and I've got the money to do it.
And they can, and they can. And there was something else that you mentioned there that I want to just hit on quickly, and that was speed. With so many investors coming into the industry now and into the beauty space, investors who are not coming from beauty and don't understand beauty and don't understand, exactly how regulated this space is. I'm seeing more and more of this push for speed, speed to market, speed to scale up, speed, 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 speed. But this is one of those spaces, those industries where we need time. We need
Mhm.
time to do the kinds of things that we need in order to earn consumer trust, right? In order to do the right thing to grow the brand. And even though you're seeing so much, word out there from influencers, saying this, that, and the other, and we all know they're being paid. So some of them are
Mhm.
better at it than others. We still I think founders don't really understand that they are still at risk for what these people say, even though, they are free to say whatever they want. They're technically not, And these VCs need to understand that when they come into the space, we can't push for time. You know what I mean? Fast, 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 because it doesn't work that way, and particularly not in this realm of testing like we're speaking about.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And consider where VCs have come from in the past, right? Beauty is a hot spot now. But if you've got somebody who's familiar with potentially fashion or something else that can be mass marketed, produced overseas, the safety standards aren't necessarily there. Human skin as the variable isn't really there, and it's not a factor. So as you come into this space, it's really important to consider timelines. If you're launching a product in May and you're not already doing your clinical testing, you're not going to have your claims and your safety data before launch. A standard safety test, like a human repeat insult patch test or HRIPT, it's 8 weeks really, and that's once you've scheduled your panel. You should be considering if you want to do an 8 week study, you really need about 14 to 16 weeks between planning and then getting your data and reports. So while you're doing your packaging, your label selection, your preservative efficacy, that's the stage when you need to be thinking about claims, not right before your launch.
100%. And again, planning ahead and planning for time. There are things that you can't speed up. You can't speed up stability testing, for
Mhm.
example. And particularly if you're looking at an OTC, and we're going to be talking SPF in a second, but there's a minimum of 6 months that you're going to need there for that test. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? There's no speeding this to market. So you mentioned HRIPT, the HRIPT. So let's just talk about the basic tests that every product, whether they're an OTC or a cosmetic, is going to require.
Mhm.
As far as I understand, you've got your sensitivity test, your patch test, your human repeat insult patch test. You've got your preservative efficacy testing, your PET for microbes, and you've got your stability testing, right? And this is going to give you your shelf life.
Mhm.
Can you expand a little on that? And if there are other tests that are required by FDA, if those are required, why are they required? How does FDA play into all of this, in terms of their must-haves?
Okay, so you mentioned three different types of tests. Preservative is really going to be like a must-have because you're going to put it's going to impact stability, shelf life, and consumer health. Then you've got stability. Those are not necessarily fully required, like by a set FDA standard, depending on product category. They would still be things that I would tell you you should do regardless of your format in every single product. There's a few exceptions, like if you're not a water-based formula, so preservative might not be as much of a factor. Then you mentioned the safety tests we talked about. So HRIPT, repeat insult patch testing. That is actually not an FDA required test. I would tell you if you're going to the market, mass market, it's a threefold scenario because it will prove non-sensitizing or sensitivity, which is a long-term sort of allergenic potential of a product. It will also give you short-term irritation and erythemal responses. On top of that, it will provide you what I would call a reasonably cheap insurance policy for your product. So if you get some wayward consumer who's attempting to make a nefarious claim against your company that's unfounded, you can say, we did this test, which isn't even required, so we believe we're protected. And that will get you a fair amount of groundwork or like protection. The last element, the third element would be what's actually, let's say, supply chain or retail chain required, but not mandated by the FDA. And that is where we see most of the pressure now. So you get the QVC, the Sephora, the Ulta Beauty, even the Targets, the Walmarts, Amazon even is taking products down with takedown letters stating that there are claims being made and you're not allowed to state them until you provide test reports and sufficient data. That sufficient data element is also what I personally believe FDA hides behind a little bit. So they don't want to step into the industry further than they are. They just tell you you need to have sufficient claim support data, not overstep your product performance, and then provide sufficient safety testing data, which most of us consider in industry the HRIPT to fulfill. That would include retail. But really, the pressure comes from the retail side, not the FDA side, while we're here in the cosmetic space.
Okay. And that's interesting because another thing that comes a lot up a lot, particularly in my regulatory conversations, is how state regulation seems to be moving faster than federal. So you'll see California bringing out their Prop 65s and all, and New York is in the middle of looking at a new bill, and all of these seems to be moving faster than the FDA. And I mean, Brian, I know this is a regulatory question, but do you think that is on purpose? Because I think a lot of investors and a lot of people coming from outside of the United States don't realize that, there are also differences state to state. And I don't know whether how much that affects testing, but if you're looking at certain states requiring that there are certain ingredients that need to be looked at, I would imagine this is going to fall squarely into, the testing realm.
Mhm. I would definitely say, based on the political climate, any given 4 years, that the FDA can sort of change its focus. So that is because there's elected officials involved. There's a lot of directional changes that can come from one administration to the next. So that's a factor. On top of that, the cosmetic space and OTC are sort of dual regulated because cosmetics fall under the F portion of the FDA. It's a little C next to the F in FDA. OTC falls under the D or the drug realm, but it's so unlike pharmaceutical product development and support. So you got two branches that really don't necessarily communicate and are extremely siloed from one another, and that leads to interesting feedback for the industry as a whole. As we stand right now, hopefully there's a new sunscreen ingredient after 25 some odd years that's about to come out in the US, thanks to DSM Firmenich. And that's going to lead to a lot of really good positive development. But when it takes 25 years, somebody's entire career to launch a new ingredient, you do get people who are extremely frustrated. You get people who don't toe the line. You'll find a lot of brands out there that are doing quasi OTC. So they're targeting sebum or oil. They're talking about redness instead of acne. They don't have the OTC ingredient. They just don't want to get regulated that way. And they're trying to, I'm not going to say skirt the line, but they're definitely trying to find a market next to the line.
Oh yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I hear it all day long. If there's not a loophole, if there's not a shortcut I can take, how am I going to make any money?
Yep.
So, and again, budgets, everything's budget, budget, budget. And part of the budget conversation is how do I get out of doing these tests? Like, what do I have to do? And what can I get out of? And those are never conversations I like having because, I think you're looking for trouble down the road. To your point about, somebody comes up with something, if you haven't done your HRIPT, they can say whatever they want. You can't prove that they're wrong, right?
Mhm.
You've done your testing. You can say, hey, listen, here's the test results. We're good. You can say whatever you want, but here's the proof, right?
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I have this budget argument with clients all the time.
Now, with the budget, it is really important to consider that even something let's call it mandatory in industry like the HRIPT, it does have claims that are associated with it, and claims are value generators for your product and your brand. So consumers want safer products. They want products that they have some level of faith in that are going to work the way that they claim that they are. So whether it's safety, talking about being hypoallergenic or dermatologist tested, that would be like a low level claim support on the safety side that's relatively cheap on a per SKU level. On top of that, if you go out and you run a clinical study and you get really great before and after photography out of it, that is going to help you drive sales. So it's not just a mandatory cost side input like preservative efficacy might be. You're never going to sell more because you passed that test. You're just getting on the market. So by differentiating yourself by way of your clinicals and your before and afters or your safety testing even, you can give yourself a competitive edge.
And you mentioned earlier about a new SPF, and I'm not going to go down that road because that's a rabbit hole we can have an entire episode on. But let's talk SPF. Because SPF is one of the highest risk claims in beauty since it crosses into public health, which makes testing integrity non-negotiable. Talking of budgets. However, but before we go further, I want to pause for a moment, especially for international viewers, because sunscreen is one of the clearest examples of how differently beauty is regulated across markets. In many parts of the world, including the EU, sunscreen is regulated as a cosmetic product. But in the United States, it's an OTC.
Mhm.
In the US, SPF products are classified as drugs, which means when a brand sells sunscreen in the US, they're not just making a cosmetic claim, they're making a drug claim, and the FDA treats it that way. What's important to understand is that SPF testing isn't just marketing support. In the US, it becomes regulatory evidence that affects whether your product can legally be sold, whether your claims are compliant, and whether the brand is exposed to enforcement risk. So, although in the EU, SPF products are considered and regulated like skincare, in the US, they're regulated as pharmaceuticals. And that difference changes everything from testing standards to documentation to liability. This distinction is exactly why the recent scandals surrounding SPF testing became such a serious industry event. Because when the integrity of SPF testing broke down, it's not just a lab issue. It became a regulatory issue, a brand issue, and an investor issue. So, Brian, with that context, let's go back to the beginning. Why is SPF testing uniquely vulnerable scientifically and operationally compared to other cosmetic claims?
The biggest reason I would say is because SPF in upon itself is actually an efficacy and a safety claim. It's very unique in that facet because if your product claims to be an SPF 50 and it's actually an SPF 4 and you have a day out at the beach or working in the garden, you're going to know all about it. You're going to end up with a potential sunburn. You will get continuous long-term life accumulating exposure. You put yourself into DNA damage risk. So if an SPF isn't performing at its target or label claim level, it's putting consumers directly at risk. On the other hand, if you have a wrinkle reduction cream and it doesn't reduce your fine lines and wrinkles in 8 weeks or less, you're not actually going to end up any worse off than you were from the start. So because it has this dual-natured sort of double-edged sword of safety and efficacy, it's completely unique as a claim. It's also very widely used. I mean, think about how many different formats sunscreens come in. You end up with moisturizing and anti-aging dailies. You end up with spray stuff, high SPFs, water resistant. So it's so prevalent throughout society. And it does also fall into this very unique, it goes in cosmetics, but it's still a drug sort of, angle that a lot of other products don't have to deal with. Based on that, I think some brands think they all need a daily SPF to go with their facial care routine. Any dermatologist would tell you wear an SPF daily, regardless of what latitude you live at. So it's an important distinction and it's an important part of the routine. So without a daily SPF, can you really compete with your new skincare regimen? So people jump into it a bit early sometimes without knowing all of the facts, and that's what can put brands at some level of risk. On top of that, there has been foul play in, especially in the SPF testing field, going back as far as like 2016, 2017 with AMA Laboratories. So like there is a history here of a very large percentage of products which potentially didn't line up with what they stated on their labels. There was proven fraud in that case. People went to jail and were fined tens of millions of dollars. And most consumers probably still don't know that that ever happened.
You know what? It's crazy when you say that because, there is a downstream effect to what happens at the lab. You know what I mean? Think about, brands. You can't, what happens in the lab isn't happening in a vacuum. It's going to affect you, right? So
Hmm.
think of the effects that this had from an investment standpoint to all of those brands who, ran with it, had their products up on the in the market, and what that must have cost them, from a recall standpoint,
Yep.
and it's not just that it's recalled. You're going to have to go back and have all that testing done again. All of those expenses, no one's giving you your money back.
For sure. That's the number one thing you're going to have to do even before you get to a recall is get your product tested elsewhere. If you have reason to believe your product has been connected to labs that have been mentioned in the news, by all means, go get it tested somewhere else. If you come back and you have a second, set of materials that's stating you're hitting your SPF label claims, then great. I'll tell you guys like firsthand too, if you have a product that's got 4% TiO2 and 4% zinc, it is not an SPF 50. But like, go back, look over what you got. There's plenty of products out there with those exact percentages. You cannot get a water resistant SPF 50 with that level of actives unless you go to a lab that's hyperinflating your clinicals.
And it's actually scary because we're talking to a lot of people here who are new and are listening to this because they want to understand what they're getting themselves into. And hearing stuff like this has got to be terrifying because it's like, how do we know who to trust? And all I can say at this point in time is that reach out to you, reach out to me. You know what I mean? If you don't, we can certainly, if we can't help you ourselves, we can certainly point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
And as long as you are aware, I think that's what's most important. But so carrying on with SPF, what makes SPF such a high stakes investor issue versus something like hydration and texture? And you're probably going to be repeating a bit of what you've already said,
Mhm.
but talking high stakes, this is SPF, this is a high stakes game.
The entry level test requirement for dropping a sunscreen product is going to be higher than if you were just putting, like, just let's say a basic foundation on the market without other secondary claims. Now you have a foundation with SPF 15 and you've upped the bar because not only do you need to do the FDA regulated efficacy work to get to that SPF 15 number, but you also now have to ensure your entire supply chain is GMP certified and approved because you're now making a drug product, whether you like it or not. So it's not just about that preliminary test. There's a lot of other secondary checks and balances and compliance issues. And now you have to be able to commit the resources to auditing all those different steps of the process, again, to make sure that they're FDA compliant. Because as the brand, like we were saying earlier, that does become your responsibility. It's not acceptable just to accept what it says on the paper without having done your own due diligence. Now, there's lots of professionals out there who do this for a living. So you can hire an auditing consultant who does GMP work, get them to go visit everyone on your supply chain. You don't have to fly all around the country or the world hitting every site if you trust the person to do that.
Mhm.
As a founder, I totally understand what it's like to wear a bajillion different hats on any given day. You can't be an expert on everything. So think of these people almost as like a fractional C-level executive on the auditing and compliance side. You need that if you are going to start your new niche skincare brand off the right way and you're going to touch OTC.
Absolutely, because once you step foot into that OTC lane, the FDA are looking at you very differently.
Mhm.
Okay, so when brands build their positioning around SPF protection, what actually happens when the data goes wrong, even if it was unintentional?
What we've seen in the last year in Australia in particular is a Australian government, that the TGA, which represents the same sort of level as FDA down under. So TGA stepped in after a consumer advocacy group called Choice pulled some products off shelves like they do every year and tested them for SPF. This particular year, a really large percentage of products came back under their purported SPF. That happens from time to time, but what was unique this year is that many of the products were actually tested at the same laboratory, which is called Princeton Consumer Research, which is a US based company. So, because many of the products tied back to the same company, the TGA got involved, started asking some questions. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation got involved, and it became a major consumer issue. Even though only a handful of products were tested, one of the products was actually traced back to a bench shared formula that went out to over a dozen different brands. So the scope of the Australian market for sunscreens, which was affected, ended up being staggering, even though only, 20 products or so were initially tested. And I think this was sort of a wake-up call, because what people did on the brand side was immediately say, no, we have this test data, so what you're saying can't be true. And it turned out very quickly that a lot of people had the same test data. So one test had been conducted on 12 or 13 different formulas. This goes back to what I've been saying, which is that as the manufacturer and the brand, it is your responsibility. You can't take your contract manufacturer's word for it. You can't take your testing lab's word for it. And once those reports went online, I mean, myself and other industry professionals were able to look at them and be like, there are very clear holes here. It says that this lab did something on one day. They ended up doing it 2 days later. Of course, the sunburn dissipated over that time, and there's room for inflation. And those elements, a general consumer or layperson, really any lawyer could look in that and say, they didn't follow the exact procedure that they laid out in that test. It's not like you need to be a total expert on sunscreen testing or a photobiologist. If you read what it says a company is going to do and they don't do it, that's a huge problem.
Mm, No, absolutely. And I just want to carry on down this PCR road specifically.
I figured you would.
It's actually yeah. I'm
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that to you.
uh, sorry, audience. I'm on the back end of bronchitis, and he promised me he wouldn't make me laugh because if he makes me laugh, it makes me cough. So
Now I feel bad.
no, you don't. So my apologies for that horrible sounding cough, but I'll try to get it under control. So my question about PCR is, just looking at the whole situation, what did it reveal about how the industry relies on labs without truly auditing them? And at the same time, do you think brands even know to audit them? Or do they just, well, I mean, we know they just take everything for granted, but, I mean, I don't know. I just feel like, the industry just relies on labs, takes everything for granted, as we've been talking about. And I just think that reveals a whole lot about where we are. And do you think this has changed since everything with PCR?
I think one thing that you noted on is particularly important, which was you're alluding to whether or not brands know that they actually have the responsibility to audit their labs. I think in the majority of cases that the answer is leaning towards no, they don't realize that's one of their responsibilities. They don't necessarily think of testing as part of the supply chain the same way they do with packaging and raw material sourcing, when in fact it's almost a more risky portion of the supply chain when you consider the human factor and the human element. So I would say PCR stuff was a big wake up call in Australia. Um, realistically, here in the US, there haven't been a wide range of recalls yet. There hasn't been a regulatory focus. There hasn't been, as far as I know, a direct FDA audit into the sites or the labs that, were used for this type of testing. Being a US company, being somewhere I used to work, I know for sure that they have many US customers. And I mean, all I can say is that it is your responsibility to audit your labs. Here at Validated Claim Support, let's say I worked with 50 brands last year, maybe 15 to 20 of them came on site to check us out, whether it was before their study or during their study to monitor. So, like, even in my world, I would say less than half of brands are physically coming here to check the work that we're doing. And that is definitely alarming for consumers. I love having people come to the lab. Like it's a great way to show off what we built, which I'm very proud of. So I think it has to be like a threefold element. As a brand, as a founder, you should be looking behind the door, get behind the curtain, see what's happening, build your trust. And again, whether that's you or your fractional regulatory consultant, make sure it gets done. And then on top of that, right now, if you're working with labs like this, I don't think you immediately need to recall, which we also just discussed. Like, just run a retest. Another SPF test is going to cost you a couple of grand. A recall is going to cost you multiple millions of dollars, depending on your scale. If you run into the potential where your target SPF is much lower, I mean, you can technically phase products out, but I would say get ahead of it now because from where I'm sitting, there has to be some further industry self-regulation or FDA action given the scope of impact here in the US that just hasn't been addressed yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other thing to remember, founders, brands out there, you know, you can do a voluntary recall or phase out,
Mhm.
which is going to be a lot less reputationally damaging than when you're doing a forced recall.
For sure.
So, yeah, just the same way as, you're going to audit your books, audit your testing data. You know what I mean? Just send some of your stuff, some of your more important, tests off to a third party lab and just have them, run their own test and see how it compares to the test results you're working with. Again, you're welcome to come to me. You're welcome to come to Brian. We can always help you, steer you in the right direction if we can't help you directly. Anyway, so
For a little extra
um,
clarity there too, I just want to point out, like I'm not doing SPF testing here at Validated Claim Support. So, I mean, if you have questions, it's not a conflict of interest. I'll help you get to a lab I trust. I don't have a vested interest in it. So, other types of testing I do on a daily basis. SPF wise, I'm not asking you to come to me because I'm going to be making money off it, but I'm very much happy to consult and help.
No, absolutely. And I think everyone who's been, watching so far knows that there's nothing that we do on this show that is promotional. That's not why we're having these conversations. So
Yeah.
please, anyone, just feel free to reach out to anyone that, that you hear me talk to and as like I said, reach out to me. I have no vested interest in any of this either, other than to help the industry become better so that we can all do well by it. Anyway,
Well, if consumers
moving
if
on.
consumers demand more from the brands that are manufacturing products, people who are open and transparent, who work in the industry, all do stand to benefit from having done things the right way and
Mhm.
getting ahead of it.
No, absolutely. And in the end, consumers are the ones who really do benefit because that's why we're doing this for the consumer health. Okay, so let's talk about things that hide in plain sight. When you were at PCR, what was the earliest red flag or any of the other labs you've worked at in the past? What were the earliest red flags that suggested results might not be reliable?
What I've seen in the past in general, where I've worked, is patterns that emerge with data that is too good to be true. And then on top of that, you have a sort of management-led siloing effect across different departments. So it can be difficult to track how many participants really came through, how many people actually got paid. And these are private companies that are owner and operator led. So no matter what, they try and tell you the owner and operator knows where the money is going. So I think the biggest red flag, which you can look for, is it's difficult from the outside, but the biggest red flag you can see on the inside is the potential for less test participants to be involved on clinical studies than are actually being reported. As an example, you've got an SPF test on 10 people. Let's use SPF testing as a prime example because it's one we've been talking about. So for an FDA SPF test, 10 people need to begin and 10 people need to complete. 10 people need to complete. In order for 10 people to complete, you may actually need to enroll 14 people because somebody had to pick up a kid from soccer practice. Somebody else had an erythemal response on day one because they didn't report that they took like an Advil in the morning or some kind of like antibacterial agent. So you have these dropouts. You're testing a product as well as a government regulated control, as well as an untreated site. It's very likely you're not going to have a linear progression of redness that's perfect and attainable every time. So the thing that you can very easily see, even as an outsider, is if you have 10 people beginning a test and 10 people completing it, and this test scales over a whole week, you have to assume sometimes life's going to get in the way. If 100 times 10 people start and 10 people begin, that's not in the realm of possibility from where I sit.
No, no, no. Statistically speaking, yeah. All right. So, I mean, talking of things we've seen, I mean, reports I've seen personally that, raise flags for me are things with suspiciously tight data, as you mentioned, repeated values, missing variability, unclear methodology. That's one I see all the time, or absolutely no audit trail. So, what should investors or founders look for in reports that signal to them that something may be off? What is something they could see with layman eyes?
Dropped participants. When you look at the data, you want to see imperfections. Imperfections are real life. So you should see a random wacky number here or there. You should see this study, 14 people began and only 10 completed. You should see people drop out. You should see adverse events, whether they're product related or not. If somebody is on a patch test or an SPF test and it's snowy and icy outside, if they slip and break their leg and get hospitalized, that's still an adverse event that has to get reported in the study documentation, even though it's not product related. So it's not something you might have to track through MOCRA necessarily. However, it happens all the time. So if you're not seeing the human element, which is variability and unstructured data, unknowns, dropouts, that's something anybody can look for. And the lab ideally is going to have a procedure for reporting on these types of things. They're going to be transparent with you about how they go about it. If someone tells you they don't have an adverse event procedure or that never happens here, it's just not possible. And people fall down and get hurt and get hospitalized every day, knock on wood and all that, but it's part of life. So you want to see that life gets in the way. And sometimes there's these randomized reactions. Sometimes people don't use the product correctly, even though you instructed them to do so and they signed off saying they would do it right. That's why sample size is such a sort of interesting factor for statistical significance in clinicals. And interestingly, the SPF test, as we're talking about, only has a true end sample size of 10, whereas most clinical studies would require 25 or 30 people for statistical power.
And Brian, can we apply the same thing let's talk about stability testing here for a second, because, you know, the types of tests we've been talking about all happen in third-party labs, but there's some testing that actually happens at a CM level. And stability testing is one of them. And now this is where we are completely putting our trust in our CM because it's at that level where stability where the stability data is collected. And this is also a place where I have seen suspicious data, where I've turned around and had to question, this doesn't look right. So can we apply that same question now to the CM, to stability data?
I think you definitely can, and it's a great area for me to say I have way less experience involved with stability testing than I do efficacy. And knowing that about myself, this is one of those times where I would never do the audit myself because I don't know what to look for. So
Mm,
even though contract manufacturer is giving you that report as part of a value add, if they're sort of a higher profile CM, some of them won't. Still, some of them will put it on you to do the work outside. But that's one of those times where the risk is not necessarily worth the reward if you're not auditing it yourself. So no matter who's giving you a test report or a piece of paper, my answer is the same. Just don't trust it unless you've verified it as a third party.
mm, mm. Look, I mean, I always feel like there's a little conflict of interest anytime, you've got everything in the hands of the CM,
Sure.
because they want your business. Their business is to say yes to you. And I've
Yeah.
and I've seen it way too many times
Well, take it back
where
to what we talked about with efficacy, which is you would never really get away with doing claims in-house in your own brand because you have a bias. You want the product to pass. I'm not going to say that's what contract manufacturers want, but there definitely is a benefit to them if the products and are passing.
Mhm.
So whether or not they're acting on it, there's the potential for a conflict and bias, which is reason enough to audit it.
Absolutely, 100%. Anytime to me that there's even a slight opportunity that there could be a conflict or a bias. You know what I mean? I would prefer to have third party involved, and send it off to a third party lab, even for stability testing. Just so the audience who are not familiar with contract manufacturing, it's when there are delays in contract manufacturers are losing money because you want to make sure that everything is moving and moving forward at a good pace because that's how you make your money. It's got to go from the R&D lab, into the testing lab, into the
Yep.
QC lab, and then from there it goes out on the floor for production. So if there's a delay somewhere between the time that the product has been accepted and signed off on by the customer, to the time that it's produced, this is where they're losing money. So,
Most
in my
definitely.
opinion, whether they are the ones doing the stability testing, they are sending you samples. Send the samples off to have stability testing or order extra samples to send off to a third party lab yourself.
Yep.
In the whole scheme of things, from a budget standpoint, it's going to cost you a whole lot less money to do this up front than it would if there was an issue later on down the line. Um, I don't know if you want to react to that, but I was going to, move on to the next
I think
question
time
regarding. Mhm.
the timelines are everything, right? Every day not on the shelf is money that you now didn't make. It's the cost starting to exceed revenue, or maybe revenue is still zero. So all of this stuff requires really well put together forethought and planning. And you can't jump one step in the chain. So on the preservative side, if you fail PET and you already have your product out there for efficacy, you're gonna have to start again. And sometimes, like we've been talking about, your product should fail. So if you're raising capital and you're starting a beauty brand, don't factor in exactly what the cost is going to be if everything goes right. You have to assume somewhere along the way something is going to get a delay. Budget yourself 4 or 6 months worth of extra capital, or else you're going to struggle to survive when something inevitably doesn't go exactly according to plan.
100%. And don't try to take shortcuts because the shortcuts always end up becoming expensive. And I see it all the time where they would try to take time shortcuts in timelines. So knowing that, say, for example, stability testing, 3 months of stability is the longest test they have on their cosmetic, right? So they'll put it up for stability testing, and while it's in stability testing, they'll run their HRIP, their PET. What if it fails stability and it has to go back into the lab? Now you've just
Yep.
paid for PET, you've just paid for HRIPT. You
You
know what
got
I
to do
mean?
it all again.
Yep, yep. That's a money that just you just poured down the drain. So one step at a time. There's nothing, like we said right at the very beginning of this conversation, there is nothing that can speed up beauty. It takes time to get to the shelf. And just do it right, do it properly, set the right foundation, and things should be more smooth sailing in the long run. But just finishing off on SPF for a sec here. If the founders talking about budgets and paying for testing, they're spending this money on SPF testing, but what should they be? Are there questions that they should be asking a lab before they start signing off on anything? Because SPF is so different than other testing.
I mean, believe it or not, there's a very simple, straightforward thing that every brand can do, especially as it pertains to their SPF lab. So if you're selling your product in the US, the the testing laboratory is required to have an FDA registration and or inspection. Every single site that's testing SPF would be required to have that FDA registration. So if you're working with a multinational lab and you know that they might be pushing their products out to the UK or to Brazil or to the US, if you know your product's being tested in those markets, you can go on the FDA's website. You can go right on Google and search for current drug establishments. Type in the name of the lab you're working with and see if the physical site that's going to be testing your product has an active FDA registration. You can do it anytime. It's completely free. And last year, while all this stuff was going on, by my knowledge, Princeton Consumer Research did not have an FDA registration. In fact, the owner has reported multiple times that he believes such a thing is not necessary for his company because he's not testing products in the US.
Unbelievable. I shake my head. I have to shake my head or I'm going to laugh and then cough again. So let's move on.
Sure.
All right. So all the questions that we've been bouncing back and forth, and they aren't about mistrust as much as they're about protection. And that's to me the pivot point. Brian, let's move here from where things break, which is what we've just been talking about, to how founders and investors can actually vet labs and protect themselves. So, what credentials, accreditations, or anything else should be non-negotiable when selecting a testing lab? And I know that you just talked about registration,
Yeah.
but what else should they be looking at when they choose a lab if they're not going to ask someone from the outside to help?
I would ask a couple of simple questions. So that FDA thing is a requirement, not something that's variable, no matter what a lab will tell you. If they don't have it, move on and get into your next selection. Outside of that, you should be asking these companies about how often they have dropouts on studies and how they report dropouts on their data. What happens if somebody has an adverse event during a study? These are things that actually at the GMP level all need to be documented. So they should be able to either answer you in an email or on the phone and or provide you with an SOP or a work instructions that satisfies the full scope of what that request is. That's part of what auditing really is when you talk to these labs. So if you go in with the right set of questions, you talk about adverse events, you talk about process management, ask about how participants are compensated. Ask about how many 1099s the lab issued for the last 3 years. That'll give you an idea for how many people are making $600 or more on the testing side. Ask how they physically pay their participants, because in my experience, prior to working here, the two labs I worked for historically paid their participants in cash. And cash, as we all know, is one of the greatest corruptors and influencers on planet Earth. It's also much easier to hide than checks or refillable debit cards because there's just one solitary bank transaction where you take out 100 grand and then allegedly pay it to all those people participating in your study. If one of these brands is paying cash, if they're not in the US, I mean, there's certain places where cash may be like a better option, but I'm going to tell you, operating here in the US, that there really should not be a cash-based business model anymore. Like, we're not selling pizza.
No, 100%. So from a diligence, you'd mentioned that earlier. Let's carry on down the diligence road. How should investors build testing integrity into diligence? And can they request things like raw data, repeat testing, audit rights? How does all of that work?
It should be openly available if a lab is doing it the right way. As the sponsor of a clinical study, you should always be able to request raw data. If anybody tells you otherwise, they're again pulling a curtain over your eyes or blocking you from seeing something you should have the right to see. On top of that, you should realistically be able to turn up anytime you want at a lab. If you say, hey, I'm looking to visit during the study, and a lab is telling you, oh, no, like that's not going to work, like that day's not really so good for us, or you can come, but why don't you come to this site? We don't want you to disrupt the testing process. That's another major red flag. So, as the sponsor, you have the right to ask for or effectively demand anything you want from a documentation perspective. At the end of the day, you own the data, not the testing laboratory. Testing laboratory is not allowed to speak about it, to mention your name as a brand, or to publish it in any way, shape, or form unless you give them explicit permission.
And that's important to remember, for everyone watching and listening, because I don't think you realize that you do have rights here and that, all of this belongs to you.
Mhm.
You are the one who owns all this data. Okay, so talking of auditing, it brings me to my favorite topic, contracts. Yay! What contract terms should brands insist on to protect themselves if something goes wrong?
That's a great question. You should be explicit on breach and remedy. From a testing perspective, with things like patch or SPF, in the real world, as it pertains to total costs you're going to put into launching your product, they're not actually that high. So an RIPT might cost 1,250 bucks per SKU. An SPF test might cost 5 or 10 grand if it's water resistant. But there's much bigger inputs than the monetary side. I would tell you, don't squeeze on the financing because all of the costs for testing are upfront. So while you may have net 90 or net 120 terms with like a packaging company that's going to deliver you or a raw material supplier, you can't do that on the testing side. So don't go fighting on the financial side. Just make sure there's a recourse. So you really want to make sure that if things are proven to be ARI or there's negligence or anything along those lines, that you have the right to reclaim some of your money. But yeah, don't consider like it's not the same as squeezing a big manufacturer who's going to have warehousing of your materials. They have a physical asset. The testing side, protocol development, you got to pay the participants again. So there are a significant amount of upfront costs. So expect to spend 50% of the total cost of testing before the test actually begins.
Mm, mm, mm. And before we come to the end of our conversation here, just to round this all up, what lessons should the industry carry forward from, the PCRs of the world, not just for SPF, but for stability, safety, microbiology, claims validations? What do you think we should take away from all of this?
I'm not a scientist. I was a finance major undergrad, and you don't have to be a trained scientist to understand when something looks or sounds like it's too good to be true. If you can read through a set of procedures and then follow through and see were those things actually conducted, That's how you should read a report. That's also how you audit a company. So you ask them for their SOPs, you see how they claim that they're doing things, and then you go check and you say, did you actually do this on February 2nd, 2025? Show me the lab data for that day. Show me the data from the production line. So it's all about just getting comfortable checking if people are really doing what it is they say that they're doing. And you don't have to be an expert on that yourself. There's plenty of experts out there, plenty of consultants. So lean on people who are experts to give you the assistance you need to do double checks, spot checks, and due diligence.
Mm, mm, mm. So, Brian, in closing, if you could give one piece of advice to investors specifically who are funding a brand based on their great lab results, what would that one piece of advice be?
Remember that what I mentioned earlier holds true. So not all of testing is just a fixed cost. If the lab data is collected in a viable, reproducible, transparent, and efficacious manner, it can help you build value for your brand, to build consumer confidence, and to actually support claims along the lines of science-backed beauty. But don't make that claim on your brand if it's watered down and it doesn't hold true, and you can't prove the science behind your brand.
Okay. And on the flip side of the coin for founders, is there anything that they could implement, from the startup to reduce lab-related risk?
Start with this sort of fractional C-level scenario. I mentioned I was finance undergrad. I still employ a fractional CFO. I've got a fractional HR group. I do my IT services fractionally. You don't need a full-time employee to be running this, but you do need a seasoned expert. And it's significantly cheaper to pull somebody in fractionally. You don't have to do it, 24/7 around the clock, but you do want to set up a routine. And based on your scale, auditing can mean a lot of different things. You can do it remotely if you need to. You don't have to physically go to the sites. I would suggest that somebody does put their feet on the ground on the site, but maybe you're not there yet this year and you set up a remote auditing process instead. There's software companies out there that will just do GCP and GMP compliance audits remotely. At least you get the initial checks and balances put together then, and you've done what's required by you as stated by FDA, which is sufficient auditing of the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. So all in all, lab tests are the foundation of claims. And when that foundation is shaky, especially in categories like SPF, the consequences aren't minor. They're devastating for consumers, brands, and investors. Brian, thank you for your courage, your unwavering commitment to scientific integrity, and for helping founders and investors see what credible testing and accountability actually demand. For
No,
everyone watching and listening, if you found this episode valuable, like, subscribe, and follow Pretty Equity on YouTube and Spotify for more expert conversations on the real issues behind beauty investing. You can also follow me on LinkedIn, where I share more expert insights on the issues and answers that drive smarter beauty investment. Because in this industry, trust isn't marketing. Trust is documentation, it's data, and it's accountability. I'm Melory Johnson. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all next week.